Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Joke Rogers here in Lagos. The United States is scrambling to identify the source of a possible leak of highly classified documents that appear to reveal sensitive details about its U.S. allies, including Ukraine's vulnerabilities in its war with Russia. The Pentagon said it had made a formal referral to the Department of Justice, asking it to investigate the apparent leak of the documents, which have been circulated on social media sites, including on Twitter. The documents, which resemble non-public daily updates produced by the U.S. military's joint staff, appear to contain intelligence related to Ukraine, China, the Middle East, and Africa. The leak appears to show Washington spying on close U.S. allies, including Ukraine, South Korea, and Israel, a potentially embarrassing revelation for the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden. However, the documents appear to contain at least some errors, including battlefield casualty estimates that minimize Russian losses. The leaked documents, if proved to be true, will mean that the U.S. is more involved in the conflict and more supportive of granting Ukraine intelligence than previously known. Meanwhile, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that Russia doesn't have the slightest doubt about direct or indirect involvement of the United States and NATO in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And in the United States, an interagency effort is assessing the impact that the leaked intelligence documents could have on U.S. national security, its allies, and its partners. A statement from the U.S. Department of Defense says it'll continue to review and assess the validity of the photographed documents that are circulating on social media sites and that appear to contain sensitive and highly classified material. A former senior Pentagon official, Michael Mulroy, says the focus now is on this being a U.S. leak, as many of the documents were only in U.S. hands. A Ukrainian Defense Ministry representative is on intelligence has accused Russia of altering the highly classified Pentagon documents. Andriy Yusov, a representative of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, said, quote, "In recent decades, Russia's most successful intelligence operations have been carried out in Photoshop. Based on a preliminary analysis of these documents, we see false figures for losses on both sides. Some of the information is clearly collected from open sources." The military intelligence representative said the needs of the Ukrainian army have been discussed at all levels and that it's no secret that Ukraine is asking for aircraft, tanks, ammunition, and other things. The comments echo earlier claims by the advisor to the head of the office of President of Ukraine, Mikhailo Podolyak, who said on his Telegram channel that he believes the Russians are behind a reported leak. Ukrainian Defense Ministry official suggests that Russia altered leaked Pentagon documents. The presidential office said the leaked documents are inauthentic and have nothing to do with Ukraine's real plans, adding that they contain a large amount of fictitious information and bear the hallmarks of a Russian disinformation campaign. In the meantime, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says there's a general tendency to blame Russia for things when asked about accusations that Moscow was responsible for a major leak of U.S. intelligence documents. The U.S. national security community is grappling with fallout from the release of dozens of secret documents, including the impact on sensitive information sharing within the government and ties with other countries.
These leaks are quite interesting. They are all being studied, analyzed, widely discussed. But the fact that the United States has long since begun surveillance on various heads of state, especially in European capitals, has repeatedly surfaced and caused various scandals. It's all easy to recall, so we can't rule that out, that U.S. intelligence has spied on Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy. We know there is a tendency everywhere to blame Russia for everything. This is a general affliction, so there's nothing to comment on here.
Meanwhile, Mr. Peskov also suggested that France, whose President Emmanuel Macron visited China for talks last week, could not broker peace in Ukraine, as Paris is both indirectly and directly involved in this conflict on the side of Ukraine. The Kremlin therefore said it's still difficult to imagine any mediation efforts here. During his visit to China, Mr. Macron called on Chinese leader Xi Jinping to bring Russia back to its senses over Ukraine. The Chinese president also said China will join hands with France in urging the international community to work for a political settlement on the crisis. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has met with Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu for an unannounced meeting in the Belarusian capital, Minsk. Mr. Lukashenko told Mr. Shoigu that he wanted guarantees that Moscow would defend his country if it was attacked. The Belarusian president previously discussed the matter with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who said he had agreed with him that such security guarantees were necessary and needed to be formalized. Belarus, which currently hosts a contingent of Russian forces, has offered assistance to Moscow during its military campaign in Ukraine, which Russia calls a special military operation.
Sometime after 1994, there was the well-known Budapest Memorandum, where all the Western states and Russia swore to grant Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus full security. Of course, you know that the Western states trampled on all those agreements and declarations. There is no security anymore. It was meant to cover our economic security as well. What economic security are we talking about if they introduce sanctions against us and Russia? In case there is an attack on Belarus, Russian Federation defends Belarus like its own territory. That's the kind of guarantee we need. Actually, in the 1990s, it was more or less discussed. Now, because of what the West has been doing, it has been forgotten about. What safety guarantees can America provide us? None, apart from provoking aggression towards us. We need full security guarantees from our brothers in Russia.
Как видим мы сейчас, нам нужны полные гарантии безопасности от нашей братской России.
Let's get more on this. Joining me now is energy expert and Vice Chair, African Energy Council, Chinan Dikwal, who joins me virtually from London. Glad to have you today.
A pleasure to be here.
First, what do you make of this leaked classified Pentagon document?
I think this is quite an embarrassment for the United States government, with all due respect. For a long time, the narrative has been peddled around Russia doing very uncanny things. What this has done is it's opened up the conflict in a way that we haven't seen it before. The US has consistently said that it's playing the role of a bystander, an observer. And I think here, we're realizing that they're deeply, deeply involved in the conflict. But beyond that, I think the real issue here is that, even allies like Zelenskyy under surveillance, key allies around, all around the world. I think that's where it becomes quite embarrassing. And the question there is, what does it mean for their relationships in the Middle East? What does it mean for their relationships in Eastern Europe and around the world, and in Africa, where they're having a massive conflict of image right now? I think there's quite a lot of embarrassment around, and I think that will translate into some sort of a policy action.
Let's switch now to the crisis proper in Ukraine, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia's announcement of stationing tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Do you see any credible reason for Moscow to resort to nuclear threats in this, previously unprovoked war?
Yeah, so, this is a very interesting one. At the start of this conflict, I think on the 24th of February 2022, just over a year ago, one of the first things that Vladimir Putin did was he made it very clear that, nuclear options were on the table. And many of us looked at that as plain old rhetoric, because nothing had moved beyond that. This, I think, in the last 2 weeks, the first sort of concrete step we're seeing where Russia is stationing nuclear warheads on a different territory. I think the ray of hope, or the glimmer of hope here, is that he said very clearly that this does not violate any non-proliferation agreements. So there's a bit of restraint there. But without a doubt, we're seeing the very first move for Russia also moving westwards, west of its border, putting nuclear warheads in a different country. Now, to be very clear, Belarus is an ally of Russia. They have been, all this time. In fact, the very first time when it invaded Ukraine, Belarus provided its territory for Russia to attack in from the north into Ukraine to try to seize Kiev. That was not successful, but certainly there have been people who have stood shoulder to shoulder with Russia in that regard. So I think, is there a place for him to make threats like that? In war, everything is fair game, unfortunately. It puts everyone on their toes, puts us on our toes, and I'm really hoping that this doesn't escalate any further. But key thing to bear in mind is what Russia's done is not out of the ordinary compared to what the US have done. Over the last couple of years, the US have stationed over 100 different nuclear warheads all across Europe. So in 5 different countries across Europe, the US has about 100 different nuclear warheads. Russia has done one similar move that the US have been doing. But I think, the casualties here are you and I, the people bystanding, because this is serious business. This is very dangerous stuff.
Speaking of escalating the war, which you just alluded to, do you think Russia is attempting to manipulating the use of nuclear weapons to help win this conflict, over Ukraine?
Absolutely. I think it's using everything in its disposal to do that. One of the things that this move does is, so bear in mind, Belarus is slightly westwards of Russia, much closer into Europe. It's about 900 kilometers away from Germany. Okay, it's about 500 kilometers from central Poland. Shares a border with Poland. So what this does is he's moving the whole arsenal, the Russian nuclear arsenal, much closer into Europe and putting the threat just right there at the doorstep of Europe. And I think this is where it changes the game a little bit. Europe, an ally of the US, as we know it, and all of that. So yes, he's using everything at his disposal. I keep going back to the same thing. The real casualties of what's going on right now are the general population who are not involved in the conflict in any way, I think. But yes, without a doubt, he's using everything at his disposal to try to force some sort of a truce, perhaps, or even to get certain concessions.
Now to, Ukraine's power station, which is, in Zaporizhzhia, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which has been, under constant attacks by Moscow and has led to, crisis over the safety of the plant itself, and so many other issues in Ukraine. What should the authorities and the nuclear watchdog be doing at this time to prevent the risk of a nuclear disaster around the plant?
That's a great question. Just to be clear about that, the power plant has been on the attack, consistently, but we don't know for sure if it's, from the Russians or the Ukrainians. So we don't know for sure if it's the Russians that are, perpetuating the attacks or the Ukrainians. Certainly what we know over the last couple of months is an attack would happen, the Russians would blame the Ukrainians would blame the Russians. So that much we know. Now, to your question, there's a huge risk here because this is the biggest nuclear plant in the whole of Europe. It has 6 reactors, much of them water-cooled reactors. So this is really massive. It is massive plant. And Chernobyl, which many people know, Chernobyl, the disaster we had in 1984, is literally just about 300 miles south of Zaporizhzhia, like you described there. Now, the key thing today is for the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and Rafael Grossi, who was there last week. The fundamental thing for them, and I think he's been on ground to try to force some sort of a safety agreement. There's a lot of bombardment that's happening across the nuclear plant. We've been quite lucky that much of the bombardment has been around the buildings themselves and not quite the reactor, the dangerous stuff. Much of the critical equipment has not been hit. And that's been the safety of it. I think that's been the good news coming out of it. With sustained attack, you cannot guarantee, and there's a risk that something really catastrophic could happen. Now, the fundamental thing that the IAEA needs to do is to pull both of these parties to the table and force some sort of a safety agreement in terms of the rules of engagement of conflict around there. And I know for sure that Rafael Grossi, who's the head of the IAEA, has tried to do that, but you'd see that both parties are still accusing each other. So that's not been done. I think more efforts need to be escalated, perhaps bringing China in, who is an ally of Russia, bringing the US in, an ally of Ukraine, and trying to force all of these parties onto a table so that some sort of an agreement can be reached. But again, I stress, this is really serious stuff. A problem that can really result to a lot of casualty.
Right. So, all the things you've described there, and it brings to mind that, possibly the next thing is they could call for evacuations of people, living around. But how much can evacuations do? How troublesome is this problem really? Will evacuations work? Where they take people to? How much will they be affected in those areas as well?
Right now is the most effective solution. We're having, explosions happen all around the power plant. We're having, in fact, just the visit by Rafael Grossi last week. He said that there's an increasing militarization happening in the area. So without a doubt, evacuation is the best solution. The question is, how do you evacuate? What are the modalities of doing that? Where do you take them to? What frameworks do you have to make all of that happen? It's a big, big question. And I think to lead those kind of discussions has to be the UN. The UN have to lead that discussion, try to get, in my opinion, I think 90-95% of the people out of that area and, see what can happen. I recognize, and to be very clear, there are IAEA staff and personnel in there in the power plant. So they've been there since September of 2022, monitoring the situation and all that. So they're live on the ground. But there's not much they can do because they are more reactive as opposed to proactive. We're talking about conflict in a sort of a war zone where bullets are flying left, right, and center. Anything can happen. So to your question, evacuation is definitely the way to go.
Right, Vice Chair, African Energy Council, Chinan Dekwal, thank you for your time today on The World Today.
Pleasure.
Welcome back. The population of Avdiivka has dwindled to 1,800 people from 32,000 before the war as Russian forces target the city to try to capture it. Pavlo Kremlenko, Donetsk's regional governor, said that the Russians have turned Avdiivka into a total ruin. He said the city was hit by an airstrike today that destroyed a multi-story building. He adds that there were no casualties as all the residents of the building were evacuated in time. Avdiivka has been one of the main targets of a Russian winter offensive that Moscow hoped would reinvigorate its invasion of Ukraine, but has only been able to make small territorial advances in the east. A 50-year-old man and his 11-year-old daughter have been killed after Russian forces struck a residential building in the southeastern Ukrainian city of Zaporizhzhia. Footage shows a destroyed private house in a suburban neighborhood of the southeast Ukrainian city. Ukraine's State Emergency Service also reported that a 46-year-old woman, who it described as the wife and mother of the victims, was pulled from the wreckage. City Council Secretary Anatoly Kortev said 2 missiles had destroyed one building and damaged dozens of others during the overnight strike. The strike was the latest in a series of recent attacks on civilian targets in the region. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has used his evening address to address what he called the defeat of the evil. Mr. Zelenskyy slammed Russia during his nightly address for the deadly attack reported by Ukraine's emergency service in Zaporizhzhia overnight.
We must be sure that evil will lose. We have to believe, and we do. We have to bring the defeat of evil closer, and we are bringing it closer. Last night, the Russian army launched an S-300 missile attack on Zaporizhzhia. A residential building was hit. 3 people were inside, a man, a woman, and a child. A little girl, her name was Irina.
This year she would have turned 11. She has died. The man also died. My condolences. The woman is in serious condition. She is now in hospital receiving treatment. This is how the terrorist state spends Palm Sunday. This is how Russia puts itself in even greater isolation from the world and from humanity. Following the results of this week, I would like to personally mark the Marines of the 35th and 36th separate brigades, soldiers of the 55th Artillery Brigade who are effectively fighting in the Donetsk region. Thank you guys. I thank the soldiers of the Assault Company of the 783rd Regiment of the State Special Transport Service for active assault operations in Bakhmut and the surrounding area, as well as soldiers of the 5th Separate Assault Brigade and the 80th Separate Airborne Brigade. Well done, boys.
The VOA's Anna Chernikova joins me now from Kyiv. Anna, great to see you. Another Russian strike in the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhzhia. This is coming after Russian strikes hit the city of Kherson and Donetsk just last week. Give us an update on this situation.
Good evening. Well, yes, unfortunately, this kind of strikes, particularly Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Kherson regions, are happening quite often. I should say that if we look at the air alarm map, these areas are almost constantly under the attacks. And unfortunately, a lot of civil infrastructure is destroyed due to these attacks. What we're hearing from this latest report that, again, as also President Zelenskyy mentioned in his latest speech, residential building was hit just today. Donetsk region, the city of Avdiivka, residential building was just completely destroyed. If we talk about Zaporizhzhia, about Kherson, similar situation. So basically, we can see that artillery and missiles just hit these areas because these are the areas next to the front line, close to the front line, and basically they are pre-front line areas, as they are called, and as we can see them and recognize them at this point. Unfortunately, people suffer. Unfortunately, infrastructure is suffering. However, I should say that for the moment, there are no particular reports on big damages of energy infrastructure. What we definitely see that these areas, especially the area of Kherson region that was liberated by Ukrainian forces months ago, these areas still have energy troubles with energy because a lot of energy infrastructure have already been destroyed, but repair works are ongoing. So these new attacks particularly target civilian areas and civilian infrastructure.
So it appears that more military support are pouring in, for Ukraine. Last week, we saw Greece promising Kyiv more military support. What history of friendship does Ukraine share with Greece?
Well, Greece is joining definitely joining this group of countries that provide Ukraine with military support. And I should say that it's a long history of diplomatic relations between Ukraine and Greece, particularly military relations and military cooperation was not that that common for Ukraine and Greece, but we definitely can see that this is kind of changing, and we can see Minister of Defense of Ukraine visiting Greece and having the meetings and having this also statement about the upcoming support. What is interesting that Greece had always quite quite ties in terms of military cooperation with Russia on a particular equipment that Greece was importing from Russia. So definitely this is something, well, this is an interesting case. What we can see from this latest report that Greece is promising certain military equipment, no tanks for this moment, at least this was not officially confirmed. And actually Greece Greece representative said that no tanks for the moment are planned. But we see a lot of other things, and we see also commitment of Greece to help Ukraine and to be there for Ukraine for as long as it would be needed. So it's definitely very interesting to see how this cooperation would go on and would last, because of course Greece, is definitely a fresh and new country to join this group and join publicly this big support package that Ukraine is currently receiving from allies.
Right. So, this is my next question. Could be a little bit unrelated, but I do want to know, the Easter celebration has just, passed. Well, some would say today is the last day, but what was the mood like, where you are? I mean, there is a war, ongoing war. How was anybody able to, get some lifted spirits, celebrate in any kind of way?
In Ukraine, this next weekend would be the main Easter weekend. The previous weekend was also some confessions celebrated Easter. Of course, it was not, it's the second Easter under the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. So this 2 weeks, weekend, this weekend for Catholics and for also some other confessions, and next week for Orthodox Christians, definitely, a special time. Definitely people will try to keep certain, and have already tried, some of them to keep certain traditions and to, to be with family at this point. Second Easter under full-scale invasion, of course, is different. Of course, mood is different, but what I can see from what people are, how people are getting ready and how people are spending this Easter weekend, people want this tradition to live, and of course want this, special period to last. So people are preparing the special bread, Easter bread. People are preparing Easter eggs, like Easter treats. So this all is ongoing, and definitely it has a very different shade than pre-war time, but pre-full invasion, let's put it this way, because some areas, unfortunately, they leave it's not the second Easter under such conditions. But in general, people are trying to keep this tradition and, do everything possible to be with the families these days.
Right, Anna, thank you so much for that update, and please do continue to keep safe.
Thank you.